Hey Grace Church, how are you today? Today we're talking about how sometimes people water down the gospel to make the gospel sound kind of like a commodity to be sold. And if you listen closely to some people when they're preaching or when they're presenting the gospel, it gets watered down. So it's like it's an easier sell, if you will. And sometimes the gospel of Christ gets labeled and as advertised if it's being told as a safety donut, or excuse me, a tasty donut here on it, like I'm showing on a shelf here. It's not that, of course. People need to think the gospel needs to stick out and look attractive so that people will pick it up and try it out. But oftentimes, in the Christian world, there are those who use branding identity, market research, and even merchandising strategies, to grow their churches and sell the gospel. I heard a song this week, and I've heard it before, and I just want to bring it to your attention. It's by Casting Crowns. It's called Start Here, and it kind of speaks to this, at least the first verse does, speaks to this idea of having a really cool place where you can share the gospel, and it's all about the wow factor. And so I'm just going to read the first verse from Casting Crowns, their song called Start Here. It says, "We want our coffee in the lobby. We watch our worship on a screen. We get a rock star preacher who won't wake us from our dreams. We want our blessings in our pocket. And we keep our missions overseas. But for the hurting in our cities, would we even cross the street?" Too often churches want the gospel to be easily sold from the pulpit so that believers in the congregation don't have to do the hard work of evangelism. So, the gospel, it's not a commodity. In his book called Truth War, John MacArthur takes on this idea that churches are trying to sell the gospel. Here's what he said. This is in his book called Truth War. And he says this. He says, many church leaders have radically changed the way they look at the gospel. Rather than seeing it as a message from God that Christians are called to proclaim as Christ's ambassadors, without tampering with it or changing it in any way, they now treat it like a commodity to be sold at the market or in the market. You know, the gospel is a message from the Creator Himself. It's not a commodity object to be sold alongside everything else, like a can of beans or some donuts or whatever. All right. Paul was encouraging the church in the book of Ephesians. He was encouraging the church of Ephesus in the book of Ephesians, and he encourages us not to deviate from the truth, and it's capital T truth. He says, you know what? Don't apologize for the message of the gospel by modifying it so it's more sellable. He didn't quite say it that way, but here's what he did say. Listen for his challenge to stay focused on the gospel. And this is Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 to 15. He says this. He says, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of men in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into Him who is the head." You know, did you hear some of that? That he doesn't want us to be tossed around by messages that might be a watered down gospel, nor should we be doing that. We need to have like our listening ears on, listening for watered down messages. We need to be careful to never fall into the trap of being so focused on marketing schemes, rock star preachers, whatever, coffee in the lobby, whatever, and those branding messages to make the gospel more attractive. Let God's message stand on its own. It's a solid and movable truth that others need to hear. And our job, we simply need to tell other people about that. So, in speaking of telling other people, as you probably know, a number of our folks from our congregation are heading down to Tampa this coming week. And I guess like next week. And they're going to share the truth in a community that needs Christ. let's be in prayer for them as they go. Josh told me, he said, you know what? Pray for boldness, courage, compassion, protection as they go talk with people. And on a very practical side, pray for the logistics of getting there, back and forth, hotels, cars, transportation, and that sort of thing. So let's just pray for their safety this week as they go, their boldness, their courage, their compassion, and their protection. And as they go, let's also challenge ourselves to have someone in our lives that we are sharing the gospel with, not watered down, not selling it, but sharing it. All right, that's it for now. Hope to see you in church on Sunday.